So for this video, I'm going to be discussing my Patreon page, the different tier levels for it, and the different perks that you get. And I'm going to be discussing all of the books that I read in 2024 for my Patreon members. So if you don't know, I do have a Patreon. You can support me there for as little as $1 a month. And for this video, I'm going to be going over the first half of the video is going to be kind of discussing the different tier levels you can do for Patreon, the different ways you can support me there, and the different perks that you get for all of the Patreon levels. And then the second half of the video is going to be me discussing all of the books that I've read for the Patreon members this year. Because if you don't know, one of the perks is that I do a Patreon wheel spin every month, and the winner is going to be one of my Patreon members, and they get to pick any book that they want me to read the following month when they win. And I've read several books from Patreon members this year, and I'm basically just going to be discussing my thoughts on all of those books that I read. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So like I said, the first part of this video is going to be me talking about my Patreon page and the different tier levels and the different perks that you get with everything. So obviously, like I mentioned, you can support me there for as little as $1 a month, because the lowest paid tier is the first tier, $1 a month. And with this one, you get early access to basically all of my videos. You get early access to all readathon stuff that happens over on the Book Astronomer Discord, whether that's for Battle of the Bands readathon or Stephen King readathons. Everyone gets early access to all of that. And then kind of the most fun thing for Patreon is that we do the Patreon wheel spin every month. And if you win the Patreon wheel spin, you get to pick any book that you want me to read. And like I mentioned, the second half of the video, I'm going to be talking about all of the Patreon members' books that I've read this year. So if you're the first tier, you're paying $1 a month. When you first start out, your name gets put on the wheel spin once. And then every subsequent month that you don't win, you get another name and then another name until eventually you will win, because you will accumulate a lot of names on the wheel spin. And for the second tier, it's essentially the same perks as the first tier, except for the Patreon wheel spin, you get your name twice on the wheel spin, so you're more likely to win. And then every subsequent month, again, you get one more name on the wheel spin, so eventually you will win. And then obviously for the third tier, initially your name gets put on the wheel 3 times, so even more of a chance to win. And then, like I mentioned, there is a fourth tier. So this is the highest tier. It's obviously I should mention this too. The first tier is $1, the second tier is $2, the third tier is $3, and then the fourth and final tier is the God tier, and this is $7 a month. For the wheel spin, initially you get your name 7 times on the wheel, which is quite a lot, and then obviously you still get ones per month if you don't win. So you start out with a lot of names, so you will definitely win eventually. You have a very high chance of winning at that point. And also, if you are for God tier, like minus the wheel spin, you also get an additional 2 books for me to read. Currently, I have 3 people in God tier, and that would be Patrick, or Hordelure, and then I have Aaron and Dyslexicon. All 3 of those are God tier levels, and they each get to choose 2 books for me to read in 2025, and they've already picked out at least one of their books, and that'll be interesting to see what else they pick. But yeah, they get to pick an additional 2 books, like any books that they want me to read, I will read for them. Editing Jake here, just to pop in to say that not only for God tier do you get to choose 2 books for me to read in a year, I will also do dedicated book reviews for those and post them on my channel. So that's an additional perk. As well as reading those 2 books, I will also do dedicated reviews for them. So yeah, essentially, those are the perks. You get early access to all of my videos, you get early access to all readathon information, and the Patreon wheel spin. Every member, whether you're the lowest tier or the highest tier, gets to participate. So obviously, the higher amount of money you're paying, the more likely you are to win the Patreon wheel spin. But even if you're at the lowest tier paying $1 a month, you start out with 1 name, but every month that you don't win, I'll put your name on there again and again and again until eventually you're going to accumulate a bunch of names on the wheel spin, and you will eventually win and will eventually get to pick a book for me to read the following month. So that's kind of the perk system for my Patreon page. Definitely, if you're interested, I'll have the link down below. Sign up if you want to. Go support me there if you want to for, like I said, as little as $1 a month. And I really appreciate all of my Patreon members who stuck with me for the past few years, and all of my newer ones, and definitely all the people that are God tier. But now we've reached the fun part of the video where I get to talk about all of the books that I've read for my Patreon members in 2024. Starting with January, Dyslexicon was the winner, and he wanted me to read East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Now, this is a book that I was somewhat interested in because I've read John Steinbeck books really all throughout my life, you know, with Of Mice and Men, and I think like The Pearl, and then maybe a couple of other ones. This one's supposed to be kind of his magnum opus, so I was hoping to really enjoy this book. Unfortunately, while I did enjoy some aspects of this book was really not for me. I did end up giving it 3 stars. It was okay. I kind of got what the author was going for, but overall, it just didn't click with me. Now, I know for a lot of people, including a lot of my friends here on BookTube, including Ian the Reader, this is one of his favorite books of all time, if not his absolute favorite book. And I get it, but for me, it was just too much, and I don't even know. And I also really wasn't sure what I was getting into with this book, because this book just kind of had like an air of mystery about it. Like I wasn't really, like I knew it took place in kind of like American history. I wasn't quite sure what the time period was. The story kind of expounds on many lives of different people across several decades. And that aspect was a cool concept to do it that way, but I don't think it was like that well executed. And some characters I liked more than others. Some plot lines I liked more than others. There were some very gruesome details in this book that I wasn't expecting. But yeah, overall, it was a good book, but it's not really a book that I would go back and reread ever again. Maybe I would try another Steinbeck book, but if this is supposed to be his magnum opus, man, I don't know. But yeah, generally, this book was okay, but I ended up just settling on a 3 stars. Sorry, Ian. All right, for my February pick, Patrick Hordeleur was the winner, and the book that he wanted me to read, I think we actually buddy read this book, was Aching God by Mike Shell. And this was a fantasy book that I'd heard several people talk about and really praise, so I went into this book with pretty high expectations. Unfortunately, I didn't hate this book, but I also didn't love it. I think give this book like 3.5 stars. For me, it was good, but it really reminded me of one of my all-time favorite fantasy books, which is right on the shelf here, Kings of the Wild. This is like a 5-star, like top 10 book for me of all time. And Aching God, if I can get the book back on the shelf here, Aching God felt very similar in concept and premise, where you've got this guy basically just going on this very long journey and a lot of different side quests happen. But I think with this book, the characters weren't as memorable. The characters weren't as outstanding as the ones in Kings of the Wild. And the story itself was interesting. They're trying to find something, and, you know, they get a group of people to go find it. It was good, but definitely not great. So overall, it was a good book, but not one of the best fantasy books I'd ever read. So I settled on 3 stars. And then for March, Kate Coy was the winner, and the book that she wanted me to read was Bunny by Mona Awad, however you pronounce her name. And this book, the only thing I really knew about it was that it was supposed to be kind of a literary horror book, which sometimes that can go very well and sometimes it doesn't. I think with this book, it had a lot of good about it and then a lot of not so good about it. I settled on 3.5 stars. The one thing going for this book is that it had pretty interesting characters, and it did have some just very strange moments, like very out there moments. But overall, I think what happened was I really enjoyed kind of the first half of this book, and then the second half I didn't love as much. And some points in this book, I kind of wanted it to get a little weirder, but it kind of stuck at the same, I don't know what the word is, but I wanted it to go even further than it did. But yeah, this book overall was very good for the first half, and then the second half kind of fell off a little bit for me. I think maybe I will try another book by her, because I know she's written several books at this point, and I'm willing to try another book by her. But this one, I kind of had higher expectations for again, but I didn't absolutely love this book. I did settle on 3.5 stars, so I liked it, but I didn't love it. Next up for April, Josephina from the channel Feeny Reads, she wanted me to read the last book in this trilogy called The Last Uncharted Sky. And for some reason, the trilogy name is slipping my mind here. It's the third and final book in the Risen Kingdoms trilogy by Curtis Craddock. And she actually, the other previous times that she's won the Patreon Will Spin, she actually made me read the first book and the second book, and now she made me read the third book. And this is just a really solid fantasy trilogy. I gave all three of the books 4 stars. Not perfect fantasy books, but they're really fun, kind of pulpy fantasy books with great characters, great world building. One of the more unique world building, because it kind of takes just a little bit of everything. Like everything that you love about fantasy is in these books. It's definitely a fantasy trilogy that I could see myself going back and rereading it and having an even better time with it, knowing what it is and being more familiar with the world and the characters. I think if I go back and reread it, I'll probably rate it a lot higher, because I gave all of the books 4 stars. They were just really solid fantasy books, but I'll eventually go back and reread it, and I think I'll have an even better time. So these are definitely some of the best Patreon books that I've read in the past couple of years that I've done Patreon. So thank you, Josephina. Next up in May, A Confused Goat won, and they wanted me to read The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. Now, I think previously A Confused Goat also had me read one of his books that I can't quite remember what the title is. Let me look it up. The other book was Inherent Vice, which I also liked. I gave that book like 3.5 or 4 stars. It took place in the 70s, and it was just a lot of fun. And this book was also a lot of fun. I think this is actually Thomas Pynchon's debut, either novella or novel. And this one, kind of like with Inherent Vice, very weird, very like avant-garde writing and characters. And kind of my main love for this book was that there was just this weird conspiracy with like the postal service, and there was like a different like underground unknown postal service that was like trying to take over. And that part of the book was really interesting. I kind of wish that would have been more fleshed out. Like if that would have been kind of the whole book, I think I would have like loved this book. But there was a lot of other stuff going on in this book. But yeah, it was all fun, and you know, maybe not as memorable. Like I remember a lot about like the secret postal stuff, but kind of all the other stuff is a bit vague to me now. I could see myself going back and rereading this book. I think I either gave this 3.5 or 4 stars. Just another solid book. I definitely want to read more of Thomas Pynchon, although a lot of his other stuff is supposed to be like very out there and very weird. And some of his stuff like Gravity's Rainbow is also very long and intimidating. So I'm not quite sure if I want to tackle that just yet, but I did have a good time with The Crying of Lot 49. Next up for June, Andrea B. Knight was the winner, and she wanted me to read Unsouled by Will White, which is the very first book in the Cradle series, which is like a 12-book long fantasy series, and a little intimidating, 12 books. But this first book was very easy to get into, and there was definitely some aspects that I loved about this book, but there's a certain element that I didn't really know about going into, and kind of figuring out that and realizing that it might not all be fantasy. There might be some other elements in play here. I didn't love that aspect as much, but I really liked the main character, and I liked kind of his progression with things. And I didn't love this book. I'll just say that. I gave it 3 stars, but a lot of people say that the first book in the series is the weakest. So I will be continuing at some point in 2025 with the second book. I forget what it's called, but interesting start to a series. Hopefully it gets better from here. A lot of people say that the series just kind of gets better and better. So I'll kind of use the second book as more of a litmus test. If I like it more than book 1, I'll probably continue. If I like it the same, I might just DNF the series. But interesting start to a very long fantasy series. Next up in July, Coleridge Girl was the winner, and she wanted me to read The Mailman by Bentley Little. Now, I've heard of Bentley Little before. He's like very prolific horror author. I think he was a lot bigger in the 90s possibly. And The Mailman was definitely an interesting pick for me personally, because if you know me, I am a mailman. I work for the Postal Service. So having a villain Be a Mailman was awesome. And this book I really enjoyed. I gave it 4 stars. There were some aspects of this book I won't get into because of spoilers that I wasn't a big fan of. But overall, this was just a really fun, pulpy, just messed up horror book with an evil mailman. And it was just a lot of fun. And it definitely has me interested to check out other Bentley Little books. I've since picked up a few from local used bookstores. And yeah, this book was just a lot of fun. And I had a great time with it, and I gave it 4 stars. Definitely one of the best Patreon picks for 2024. Next up for August, Brian was the winner, and he wanted me to read Between Two Fires by, what's his name? Christopher Buhlman, I think is his name. Yeah, Christopher Buhlman, whatever. This was the same author as Black Tongue Thief, which was a previous Patreon pick, which I really didn't like that book. I gave that book like 2.5 stars, so I was a little afraid for this book, but I'd heard several people say like, oh, you'll probably like this more than Black Tongue Thief, which in fairness, I did, but I still didn't love this book. This book was more of a 3-star read, and it was kind of a horror book, kind of set. It was a horror fantasy set in like the 1300s France, which I don't love historical fantasy that much. There's some exceptions, but overall, kind of that aspects of the book I wasn't a big fan of. The characters were okay. The story was a little long-winded for me. Overall, this book wasn't bad, but it was just good. And I settled on 3 stars. Not one of my favorites. Now in September, Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads was the winner. And his initial pick was Lord of a Shattered Land by, oh God, what's his name? Howard Andrew Jones. And I'll be honest, I DNF'd this book. I got, I think, a little more than 100 pages in, and I was just messaging Andrew like, I'm really not feeling this book. I think I'm probably going to DNF it. And when I do this for Patreon, I always give them the option of just choosing a different book for me to read. And he was gracious enough to pick a different book because I did ultimately end up DNF this book. It just was not for me. It was because it's a fantasy book that like every chapter is like a new adventure kind of deal. It's the same thing with Black Tongue Thief, which I also previously mentioned that I didn't like. It's kind of the same deal with that. But Andrew ended up picking Sufficiently Advanced Magic, which I have right here, and happy to say that I really enjoyed this one by Andrew Rowe. It's the first book in the Arcane Ascension. And initially, when I first started to read it, I was a bit afraid because if you guys know my fantasy taste, I'm not the biggest fan of school settings in fantasy, and this is like what it is. It's like one of the best school fantasy books out there. But I really did enjoy this book. I really enjoyed the plot. I enjoyed the characters. I enjoyed kind of the progression of the main character because he's at a school for magic, and it's just a really unique concept, and I really enjoyed it. I definitely will be continuing with the series sometime in 2025. I give this book 4 stars, and this has the potential to be a new fantasy series favorite for me. So I went from DNFing one of Andrew's pick to really absolutely loving this one. Next up in October, Aaron was the winner, and he wanted me to just kind of pick a series to continue with, and he ultimately went with Drums of Autumn by Diana Gabaldon, and this is the 4th Outlander book, very chunky. Sad to say, though, it's called Drums of Autumn. There's like 1 mention of drums, which I think is hilarious. But overall, probably my least favorite in the series so far. I did really enjoy books 1 and 2. Those were kind of more 4-star books for me. Really enjoyed it. The 3rd book, not so much. It was more of a 3-star book. And then Drums of Autumn, kind of the same deal. Another 3-star entry. But I've heard from certain people, including my wife, who really loves this series, that it does get better. I think book 6 was one of her favorites in the series, so I will be continuing. And overall, just I enjoy the series mainly for the main character of Claire. She's one of the best fantasy protagonists out there, so just basically for her, as long as she's in the series, I'm going to continue to read it and have a good time with her POV. I think one of the main problems is that these books are starting to get very chunky, and like not a lot happens really in these 1,000-page tomes, which kind of a bummer because the first book was just like, it was very like, it's 800 pages, but it's a fairly fast-paced book for what it is, and it was really good. But this fourth book, probably my least favorite, but I will be continuing still. So still a good pick by A.A. Ron. And then for November, we had Lisa, who's actually my wife's sister. She won, and the book that she wanted me to read was The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. The only thing I really knew about this book going into it was that it's a memoir, and it's supposed to be pretty sad and depressing. And oh boy, was it. So I know a lot of people just love this book for what it is. For me, I did. It's hard to say that I enjoyed this book, because honestly, this book was just very frustrating. And that's why I gave it a 3.5 star rating. I know a lot of people give it 5 stars, but just my overall enjoyment of this book suffered because just the whole time I was reading it, I was just very frustrated because it's about this girl growing up and she just has like horrible parents. So this whole time I'm just reading it just like, ah. But, you know, it ultimately did make me feel grateful for the childhood that I had, because I did have a good childhood and I had good parents for the most part. And, you know, this book was just incredibly hard to read at times. So overall, I'm glad that I read it, but I can't really say that I enjoyed it. So 3.5 stars, it's pretty good. And then for December, Kate won again. And the initial book that she wanted me to read was Nosferatu by Joe Hill. Now, a few years back, I tried to read this book and I DNF'd it, but I kept it because I think at the time I felt like maybe I just wasn't in the mood for it. So I kept it around, and then she ended up picking this book and I was like, oh, okay, we'll make a buddy read channel for it. And a lot of people were interested in reading it initially. Turns out I am actually the third person this month to DNF this book. And actually, once I told Kate, she kind of got, she didn't want to read it anymore either. So basically 4 people were like, we'll read something else. So I let her pick another book. And this book kind of has a funny story because she picked Mary by Nat Cassidy, which is a book that I've really been dying to read. And actually, once I told my wife about this book, she was like, oh, that's the book that she picked. And she realized that she gifted me this book for Christmas. So she let me open it up early. So an early Christmas present for my wife. But yeah, this book I'm actually still in the middle of. I have not finished it yet as of recording this. But hopefully by the time this goes up on Monday, Editing Jake will pop in here and let y'all know what I thought about this. But for right now, I'm really enjoying the book. I'm only about 50 pages in, but it's already a 5-star prediction. I'm really enjoying my time with it. And this is kind of like a, how do I describe this book? It's heavily inspired by Carrie, you know, like Mary. The author really enjoyed Carrie's story. And it's kind of like a what if like Carrie were to grow up like and be an adult. Like, what would that be like? So I'm really enjoying it for what it is right now. And hopefully, like I said, Editing Jake will pop in here and let y'all know what I thought. But it is a 5-star prediction. And I'm definitely glad that Kate decided to go with this book. All right, so that is my Patreon video where I talked about all of the different tier levels for Patreon and all of the books that I've read for my Patreons, for my Patreon members in 2024. So just as a recap, I do have 4 tiers that you can support me there for as little as $1 a month, or 2 or 3, or you can do God tier for $7 a month, which you get access to everything. You get 7 names initially on the wheel spin, and just as a bonus you get to pick 2 additional books for me to read for all of 2025. So those are the different ways you can support me there. You get early access to all of my videos. You get early access to all readathon information for Battle of the Bands and Stephen King. You also get to pick your teams early, by the way. A lot of people, like when we do readathons, you're not always guaranteed a spot on your first pick, but if you're a Patreon member, you automatically get your first team option that you want. So that's another perk. But yeah, that's Patreon. And these were the books that I read for my Patreon members, which some of them I liked more than others. I didn't really absolutely hate any of these books, besides the ones that I DNF'd. But, you know, when I do DNF your pick, I do give you the option of picking another book. And in both cases, with Sufficiently Advanced Magic, I really enjoyed that book. And with Mary, for right now, it's a 5-star prediction, so I'm really enjoying it. So, you know, it's a fun little thing that I do. And it gets me out of my comfort zone a little bit because people, always kind of just pick random books. But I found a lot of new favorites and definitely some authors that I'm willing to give another shot to. So overall, it's very fun for me and definitely worth it. And hopefully, it's worth it for my Patreon members who I can't thank enough for supporting me throughout the years. And hopefully, with this video, maybe I can convince some of y'all to be Patreon members because it's a lot of fun. We definitely have a lot of fun. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and continue to subscribe for more content. If you're not subscribed, do so if you choose so. And Bookish Drummer Discord, where if you're a Patreon member, a lot of my Patreon stuff happens on the Discord. I do have my Patreon page, but most of it just happens on the Bookish Drummer Discord for the most part. And Patreon link down below if you're interested at all. I also have my Amazon wish list if you'd like to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.